Sziasztok, barátaim, és üdvözlök benneteket. Hello and welcome to the World History Addicts podcast. I'm your host, Devin, and today we'll be discussing one of the strangest countries in Europe, that being Hungary, or Magyarország. Hungary is neither West nor East European, as they'll be very angry if you call them East European, but they're Central European. They're a nation at the crossroads of the Germanic, Slavic, and Latin world, but they're also none of the above. It has a fairly recent history compared to the other nations I've covered, and today I will talk about how Hungary went from being a land of nomadic raiders in the early Middle Ages to becoming a modern European state today. Let's begin. How are you doing, Sandra?
Good. How are you, Devin?
Oh, I'm doing pretty well. Yeah, so I'm really happy that you're able to join us for the Hungary episode. You're my first guest speaker of all time on this podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm very honored.
Thank you. Yeah, so first off, I was just going to ask, what was it like in Hungary when you visited, and what did you do there, and what did you see?
Hungary is very different from the U.S. A lot of people there are friendly. They would help you out if you're asking them directions, how to get to places. I go there to visit my godmother and my friends and relatives there.
Yeah, and is it different being a fluent Hungarian speaker versus not speaking Hungarian at all, or just speaking not fluent Hungarian?
Being a Hungarian, I kind of feel like, I'm still treated the same way as a U.S. citizen. But I do feel that when I speak the language, people do respect me more because I speak the language, and I'm kind of feel like I'm like a resident there living in Hungary.
Yeah, actually, can they tell that you don't live there? Do you have any American accent in your Hungarian that they can pick out?
I do have an accent when I talk in Hungarian.
Yeah, so they can kind of tell
Yes.
that you're not like a full-time
Right.
citizen or resident of the country.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
I see.
The way I talk.
I see. And but how do Hungarians see Americans? Do they have a positive view of Americans? Do they have a negative view? Or are they kind of more neutral about Americans?
I think they're neutral. But some of them have different views. I think I think it's just it's a mix.
Yeah, and is it actually safer in Hungary than America? Because I think overall it's a poorer country, but it's also a safer country at the same time.
It is safe to take public transportations if you're going on the bus or you're taking the train or if you're going on the subway. It is safe.
Yeah, and I take it there's not a whole lot of violent crime or just homeless people or lots
No.
of drug users everywhere.
No.
Anything? No? Wow, that sounds pretty nice. And which cities would you recommend visiting in Hungary?
I would recommend going to Budapest. That's a big city, and a lot of tourists go down there.
That's the capital, isn't it? With
Correct.
with the Danube that flows through it.
Right.
Because it used to be Buda, that's one of the cities, and Pest, that's another city, and
Right.
they were across the Danube. But then eventually they linked them together with a bridge.
Right, correct. Another one is if you like to see one of the castles in Hungary, it's called Visegrad. That's another place that a lot of tourists like to go up there.
Yeah, I've heard about Visegrad, but mostly through the Visegrad group, and I just looked it up. It's Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia. All the countries that are kind of afraid of Russia and don't want them moving too far west. Also, what were some holidays in Hungary, and what are they about?
The independence and the revolution. There's a big holiday in August when everybody takes the day off in August and they do the fireworks over the Danube River. I don't remember the name of that holiday in August, but it's a really big holiday.
Is it commemorating the 1956 Hungarian Revolution with Imre Nagy and the revolt against the Soviets?
I believe so.
Yeah. Do you know much about Imre Nagy by any chance? I think he's one of the national heroes of Hungary, next to John Hunyadi and Matyas Corvinus, I think.
That's a good question. I should know this, but I don't know that much about him.
That's all right, Sandra. Yeah, and also, I was just going to ask also about the Hungarian language. I think it's similar in the way that it's phrased to English, in that it's the person and then the action and then the object of like the thing that they're interacting with. Like if it was I spoke into the microphone in English, it would be something like that in Hungarian too. And the same is true for descriptions. Like in English, you would just say the table's white or the white table, and I think in Hungarian it would also just be just the white table.
Right.
It's not like in Spanish where it would be la mesa blanca,
Right.
where it's like the table, but it's white, a white table.
Right.
Yeah. And speaking of politics, there's I think the leader's name is Viktor Orban, and is he very popular in Hungary? Or like, does he have wide support from most people, or is
He
it kind
has
of
a
more
lot
divided?
of support from the Hungarians. He's very outspoken. He's not afraid to speak his mind and give his opinions.
Yeah, I think he's been compared to the Donald Trump of Hungary. He's known for just being very brazen and just making these big statements about why Hungary is great and we need to make Hungary great again. It's such a great country. We can make the country great again. We just have to get rid of other people who aren't Hungarian. But speaking of how great Hungary is, what is your favorite part about being a Hungarian, Sandra?
My favorite part of being Hungarian is I just like blending in with the people. I just like enjoying seeing family and friends there. I like enjoying eating the food there. When I'm there, I like to request some of my favorite dishes too that I like to eat.
What are your favorite dishes in the Hungarian cuisine?
I do like so I like the goulash. It's like a goulash, and that's how people pronounce it. It's a very special traditional soup a lot of people like to eat, Hungarians. And then I like to eat there's another soup, but it's called the sour cherry soup. It's really good. That's one of my another soup I like to eat. It's like a cold soup, and I like to put whipping cream. So those are
good.
two examples I like to give you.
That actually sounds really good.
Right.
Yeah, and are there any other special desserts that are like really only found in Hungary? Because I take it that the Hungarian cuisine is very unique, like even compared to other countries in that region.
Yeah, there's a lot of different desserts there. There is a rétes. There is that's a pastry. There is I love their Hungarian ice cream that you can get. You can order like a big ice cream cake from
Ice
one
cream
of
cake,
yeah.
wow.
And it's
That
really
sounds
good.
amazing.
It's really good too. And then there's like yeah, there's a lot of different desserts I like to eat there.
Are there any special pastries in Hungary?
There is a lot, yeah. There I'm just I just can't think of it right now from the top of my head. There's this thing called pogacha. It's really good. It's like a cheese kind of pocket, little pastry I like to snack on. And then there's different other, there's like cookies and different kinds of.
That is a lot of awesome stuff. You're making me want to visit Hungary with all this stuff.
Am I making you hungry?
Yeah, actually, you kind of are. Yeah. Well, thank you, Sandra, for answering all these questions. I will make sure to include this in the rest of the podcast, and thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I enjoy talking to you.
Thanks, Sandra. Until next time. So first off, where is Hungary and when did it begin? Hungary began much later after the Italians and after the Japanese, who I've already covered, in the early Middle Ages when nomadic tribes from the Ural Mountains migrated into Central Europe and settled in Pannonia, that being a region in the Carpathian Mountains between the Balkans and the Black Sea to the north of Turkey and to the south of Ukraine. So before the arrival of the Magyars, Pannonia was originally a land of many different tribes of people, usually Germanic or Celtic, though nearby there are also the Dacians who live in what's now modern-day Romania. But that changed in the 890s AD because the Magyars arrived under Almos and his son Arpad, and they founded the foundational Arpad dynasty. And at this point in time, the Magyars or Hungarians were still they still looked like people from Siberia. They didn't look European. But over time, they adopted Christianity and they began intermingling and intermixing with the local Slavs and Germanic people. So today, most Hungarians have a very European appearance. They don't look very different from everyone else around them. And in the 900s, they were still going through this process and they were still very aggressive and expansionist. So they actually invaded the western part of Europe, or I guess that would still be the Central European part, by invading the Holy Roman Empire. And they were eventually defeated at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955 because the Magyars relied heavily on light cavalry and horse archers, kind of like the Mongols who would show up later in history. And the hard counter to that was heavy cavalry in an area that they couldn't just outmaneuver the heavy knights. And a few decades later, one of the most successful Hungarians of all time was born in 975, and that was the great Saint King Stephen, or King Stephen I. And he was responsible for spreading Christianity throughout Hungary, and both by winning against rival claims to the throne, who had mostly pagan henchmen backing them up. And Stephen did this by getting help from foreign Christian knights and by punishing all of his subjects who ignored the Christian customs. Though Stephen also was very savvy, and he made sure to develop his own Christian institutions that were separate from the Catholic Church in order to maintain autonomy. So the Arpad dynasty ruled Hungary up until the early 1200s, and in that time they became much more integrated into European Christendom. They started developing diplomatic and trade relations with their neighbors, that being the Holy Roman Empire, or really pre-unification Germany, and the Byzantine Empire, which is the Greek-speaking remnant state of the Roman Empire in the east that didn't fall when the West did. This dynasty, the Arpad dynasty, also established this really interesting system called elective monarchy, where the nobles and the estates selected who the king was. And this system went on for many, many centuries, well after the end of the Arpad dynasty's reign, and even into times that Hungary wasn't even an independent country. So in 1222, there was the Golden Bull, or Oranyi Bulla, which was Hungary's version of the Magna Carta. It was a signed document that limited the king's power in relation to the nobles, and it limited what the king could do to the nobles. And there's also kind of a widespread myth that the Magna Carta was the foundation of all individual rights and liberties in England for everyone, and including the wider Anglosphere today. But the original document was really written for the elites of society who weren't the king, in order to prevent the king from just taking everything from them. And it wasn't really intended to give more rights to the lower classes, like, say, the peasants or the commoners. And the Golden Bull of 1222 was really not much different from that. So this is getting into the high and middle and late Middle Ages. So by this point, Hungary had already formed as a kingdom, and they were expanding into the Balkans. But then someone else expanded into Hungary, and that someone is the Mongols. The Mongols invaded in the 1240s, and this was also the time that they were also invading Poland, Ukraine, other parts of Eastern Europe, including Russia. But the Hungarians were able to resist and remain independent, though at a very great cost, and only through clever tactics like hiding inside of castles and using crossbows to take out the Mongols. And the Mongols themselves were also overreaching because, keep in mind, the Mongols are based out of Mongolia, all the way in the Far East, just north of China, and yet they're fighting all these wars and often winning on the other side of Eurasia, which I still think is very impressive, especially 800 years ago. And during the Middle Ages, after the Mongols, there were several other iconic figures like John Hunyadi, or because in Hungarian the last name goes first before the first name. It's the order is to which. It's kind of the same way that naming is in, say, Japan or China. So his actual name in Hungarian would be Hunyadi János, and his son Matthias Corvinus, also known as Matthias the Raven, would actually be Hunyadi Matyos. And they were both famous leaders, and they pioneered major strategies for defending Hungary, such as the Black Army. So János, Hunyadi János, or John Hunyadi, was actually Matthias's father. He was born in 1406, and he was from Wallachian ancestry, so not entirely Hungarian. He was a very rich man with a huge amount of land, millions and millions of acres of land, and he was arguably one of the greatest military commanders in all of Hungary's history. He won multiple battles against the Ottomans in the south, including the Siege of Belgrade, where I actually learned that he defeated Sultan Mehmet II personally. He personally led the battle that defeated the one that was personally being led by the Sultan. And I think that's very impressive because Sultan Mehmet II is the guy who finished off the Romans in 1453 during the infamous Siege of Constantinople. And his son studied the Roman military, and he created a professional corps of highly trained and well-armed soldiers to defend Hungary. And at its height, the Black Army, that's what this special army was called, was actually larger than the entirety of the French army, which was held a much larger area than Hungary. So the Black Army was in effect a national defense force because it was funded by all the nobles and, of course, all the peasants. But it was unique because they made much more of use of bombards and early guns. At this point, just handguns. I don't think at this point they even had the arquebus yet, because it was really just a tube with a metal stick at the back, and you would just hold it, and you would have to place the fuse inside the gun manually to fire it. But even with all these drawbacks, it was a very professional military, and it was also a medieval kind of institution, and it was also, in effect, a mercenary army because it contracted and hired professional soldiers, both from within Hungary, but also outside of Hungary, like say from from Italy or from the German-speaking world. And then the problem with this is that the Black Army required massive taxes on both the peasants and the nobles, and on the peasants it wasn't as big of a deal because the peasants are always taxed, but with the nobles, they became more troublesome because they resented having to pay for an army that wasn't personally theirs, and that they weren't benefiting from, because the nobles can just hire their own armies to protect themselves and their castles and their estates and all of that. So as soon as Matthias Corvinus died in 1490, the nobles tried to pay as little towards the Black Army as possible. They cut the funding, and eventually it fell apart. And this leads into the early modern era, because that being around the late 1400s, early 1500s, the early modern era saw the beginning of Hungary's golden age coming to a collapse, and because it would never be a great independent nation again, rather going through a carousel of conquest and vassaldom to other powerful nations, starting with the Ottoman Empire. 1526 is the year of the Battle of Mohacs, that being the very, very disastrous battle where the Hungarian military was weakened by the nobles refusing to pay for it. The Black Army just wasn't very powerful anymore. But the Ottomans were still on the rise, and they were also very adept at using firearms and cannons. They had already taken over the last of the Byzantines in the Sea of Constantinople in 1453. And then in 1517, they captured all of Egypt and defeated the powerful Mamluks. And keep in mind, the Mamluks had actually defeated the Mongols in open battle, which was very impressive, and the Crusaders, too. With the Black Army disbanded, the Ottomans used their janissaries. Those were actually people taken from the Balkans, usually Christian boys who had been taken by force and trained as child soldiers with muskets. And they crushed the Hungarians, and they annexed the southern part of the country. And they also killed the Hungarian King Louis II, which created a power vacuum. And less than 2 decades later, in 1541, the last independent outpost of Buda fell to the Ottomans. But the Ottomans didn't conquer all of Hungary, because in the north and in the west there was still Royal Hungary, which also wasn't independent because it was controlled by the Austrian Habsburgs. And in the eastern part, there was the Principality of Transylvania, which was semi-independent and ruled by Hungarian princes who were supported by the Ottomans, which I would say makes it something of a puppet state. So for the rest of the 1500s and into the 1600s, this tripartite division of Hungary was the status quo. But then in the late 1600s, that changed because the Ottomans overreached and overplayed their hand and went too far into Europe by trying to attack Vienna in 1683, which is part of the larger Great Turkish War. And it ended with the Ottomans being wiped out by the Polish heavy knights called the Winged Hussars. It's also in this war of 1688 that the elective monarchy system finally came to an end, and it was replaced by hereditary selection of the king in Hungary because it was just viewed as a better way to keep the kingdom stable and more predictable. So with the defeat of the Ottomans during the Great Turkish War, which ended in 1699, Hungary was freed from Ottoman dominion, but not from Austrian dominion. If you've ever seen the movie Megamind, it's really similar to that scene where Megamind gets into this fight with a superhero. He really a supervillain that he created himself, and he ends up losing. And because Megamind was known as the big mastermind who controlled the city, and he was just defeated, everyone starts celebrating when they see the new supervillain without realizing who he is. And they said, "Rejoice! Titan has freed us." And then Titan, the supervillain, looks at everyone and says, "Freed? I wouldn't say freed, more like under new management." And that's kind of what happened to Hungary. And this is a running pattern in their history, the under new management type thing, because the Austrians gained more power in Hungary after pushing out the Turks. And their empire is actually very multicultural, but there's still a kind of hierarchy with the Germans, Austrians being at the top, and other groups like Slavs and Hungarians being lower down on the hierarchy. And they have a very unique form of empire because the Austrians mostly don't expand using conquest. They don't use armies to just take more land and force people in. Instead they marry into other people's royal lines, and they form these strategic alliances, and they just get more land that way, which is also why the Austrian Empire is very kind of uncontiguous. They have land or the Habsburgs have a very non-continuous empire. Some of their land is in Spain, and some of their land is in Austria, some of their land is in Germany, and there are large areas that they don't control in between those territories. But this setup didn't come without challenges, and in 1703, a Hungarian nobleman named Francis II Rákóczi rose up with angry peasants against the ruling Austrian authorities, but they were still crushed, and there was eventually the Treaty of Szatmár in 1711, which did give some concessions to the Hungarian nobles, and it stopped the worst abuses committed by the Austrians. And this is also kind of a running theme in Hungarian history. They rise up, but then they just get crushed. But the concessions that they get from the uprising basically prevent any other future uprisings from happening. And then this leads into the 19th century, though before that, the Hungarians had been under a fairly stable occupation by the Habsburgs in the 18th century, that being the 1700s. But towards the end, there starts being nationalism, because Austria is involved in the Napoleonic Wars, largely as an opponent of the French under Napoleon. And it didn't directly threaten the grip that Austria had on its many subject people, like the Hungarians themselves, or the Slovaks, or the Romanians, or the Croats, or the Serbs. But it did set the example that nationalism was a very powerful force. And not surprisingly, there were increasingly nationalist movements within the Austrian sphere. So in 1848, Europe explodes with many different revolutions and uprisings and riots all across the continent, largely in response to reactionary measures placed by the winners of the Napoleonic Wars, mostly the British and their allies on the continent, which were meant to shut down liberal and nationalist reforms, which backfired, and angry people, both commoners and nobles, rose up in revolt. Hungary was one of the hotspots of these revolutions, and it was also one of the longest, because the revolts weren't put down until 1849, and the Austrians actually had to call in the Russian soldiers to come down and help them put down the rebellion. So Austrians' power was beginning to wane, and was at this point because there's a new big dog in the area, and that was the Kingdom of Prussia. The Prussians didn't start in the 1800s; they actually started all the way back, technically speaking, back into the Middle Ages, but that was more under the Order of the Teutonic Knights. But Prussia as a state showed up in the 1700s, and they just got more and more powerful over time because they were very, very effective militarily. There was even a saying that said, most countries are a state with a military, but the Prussians are a military that happens to have a state. They're very effective at fighting wars, but they're also very innovative, and they had a very intelligent society because they're home to philosophers like Karl Marx, the founder of communism, Immanuel Kant, who is known for his deontological moral reasoning, Friedrich Nietzsche, the famous nihilist thinker, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, the German idealist and believer in knowledge accumulation and progress over history, and of course the famous Karl von Clausewitz, who's known for his treatises on warfare. In 1866, Austria and Prussia get into a war over the future of Germany because they know that eventually Germany is going to unify, and one of them is going to be the one to unify, and they can get all the glory for putting Germany together. But because the Prussians are so much more effective, they beat up the Austrians. And because of this, and because the Austrians are weakened after that war, they have to give more rights to their minority groups, particularly the Hungarians. And the year later, after that, in 1867, the Austro-Hungarian Empire gets founded. And the rest of the 19th century, some groups start breaking away, like the Serbs. But the rest of the century is fairly uneventful, and not a whole lot happens outside of the cities of Buda and Pest being combined into Budapest in 1873. And there was also modernization of the country in the 1890s. But where this really goes down is in World War I, because Hungary, prior to World War I, wasn't an independent country. It was joined together with the Austrians in a unique dual monarchy style system. They were just the largest and I think also the loudest minority group within the empire. But they were still just one among many, and many groups served Emperor Franz Joseph. So the Great War started because of Austria-Hungary, because the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was going around in Serbia when someone tried to shoot him, and then someone threw bombs at his car, but the bombs actually rolled underneath and blew up a different car. And Franz Ferdinand himself actually went out to the hospital to visit the victims. And as he was doing this, some of the assassins who were supposed to be there but got lost went to a sandwich shop because they thought that they had missed their opportunity. And then as that was happening, Franz Ferdinand's driver got lost, went down a wrong turn, and ended up at that same sandwich shop where he was gunned down along with his wife. Now, this probably wouldn't have started the war, but the problem is that Germany was backing Austria-Hungary. The Germans were the main growing power on the European continent, I guess maybe in a similar way that the French were towards the beginning of the 1800s. And the British were starting to see them as a real threat. So there was this ongoing tension between German expansion power and the British establishment power trying to maintain their position, because the British have always kind of operated under the idea that if the European continent were ever to get invaded, they could all turn against the British, and that would become a major problem for them, just in terms of sheer numbers. So the Austrians, along with the Germans, the Austrians make demands from Serbia that they don't even expect to be fulfilled, because it's all part of the plan to declare war and neutralize the Serbs and the Montenegrins, along with the larger threat of just Pan-Slavism in general. Because the Russians are using Pan-Slavism in order to gain support among the minority Slavs within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So the Austrians declare war, and they, along with the Germans and the Bulgarians and the Ottomans, because they're now on the same side, despite having many wars in the past, they go to war against the Entente, the main three at this point being the British, the French, and the Russians, though the Italians also end up fighting for the Allies, or Entente. Austria-Hungary fights on four different fronts. There's the northeastern front against the Russian Empire. There's the southern front against the Serbs and Montenegrins. In the southeast, they fight against the Romanians, who had also joined on the Entente side. And in the southwest, they face the Italians, who I got covered in the history of Italy. So the northeast front against Russia was the most costly and bloody, as the Austro-Hungarians lost millions of soldiers, though it was also very costly for the Russians, but they were much more numerous than the Austro-Hungarians, so they could afford to lose more people. The southern front against Serbia and Montenegro was actually very, very embarrassing for them, because the Serbs were actually heavily outnumbered, but because they were, I believe, much more cohesive and they were much more committed to the fight, they were able to outmaneuver and defeat the much larger Austro-Hungarian armies, though. I think that was also because the war plans made by the Austro-Hungarians got leaked early on, so the Serbs knew what they would do, and they could preempt their attacks more effectively. Though eventually, just due to sheer numbers, the Serbs did get worn down, and they were occupied by 1915. The Romanian front was kind of a side note. It wasn't especially taxing, and once the Germans stepped in, the Romanians went down pretty easily. And then you have the Italian front, which is really interesting because it was very costly for the Italians. And there were 12 different battles over this river in between the Austrians and the Italians called the Battles of Isonzo, which went from, I think it was 1916 all the way up to 1918. And the Italians eventually overcame the Austro-Hungarians at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. And then in 1918, the Great War came to an end. And because the entrance of the United States in 1917 more than compensated for the withdrawal of the Russian Empire, and because the Russians had been overthrown by the Bolsheviks during the October Revolution, and the Germans signed an armistice after they ran out of supplies, and there started to be major strikes around the empire. But Austria-Hungary also saw major nationalist uprisings within it from the various minority groups. The collapse wasn't just due to there being lots of diversity. It was also because the monarchy had shown itself to be very weak by performing so poorly in the war, and also there was a huge amount of economic mismanagement during the war efforts by the central government, and it plunged the whole empire into deprivation and misery that quickly became intolerable for most people. So in the interwar, that being right after 1918, Hungary broke itself apart from Austria during the Aster Revolution, and they put a democratic government in place, which didn't even last until the end of 1919 because a man named Bela Kun showed up, and because the democratic leaders turned over power to him, Hungary actually became another short-lived communist country, which also was very authoritarian and cracked down on all of its dissenters. And this also created a backlash against it, with the Romanians invading Hungary and ousting Bela Kun. And then in 1920, there was the infamous and very, very controversial, even to this day, Treaty of Trianon, which removed the majority of Hungary's land. It reduced the population from 21 million down to 7.6 million, and it reduced Hungary's land territory by 72%. Many of the people who weren't in Hungary's borders, who were no longer there, were actually not Hungarian in the first place. They were Romanian, Czech, or Croats, and some were even German. But there were now 3 million ethnic Hungarians living outside of Hungary's borders, like the post-Treaty of Trianon borders. So this is essentially a much worse version of for Hungary for the Treaty of Versailles. It was a post-World War I status quo that left a very deep bitterness and anger inside of the country that would reemerge in World War II. And this also saw Hungary return to being a kingdom, but this time with an admiral instead of king, which is kind of bizarre because by this point, Hungary is a landlocked nation that doesn't even have a navy, but they're still run by an admiral. The reason for this is actually because Admiral Horthy Miklos was originally an admiral. He was a naval commander back in the days when they weren't landlocked and they had a navy. But because he was such a respected guy, he maintained the title admiral, and he became the regent of Hungary. But he was also a nationalist, and he was very committed to reversing the Treaty of Trianon, and he ordered a white terror. That's the opposite of a communist red terror, where they just oppress everyone who doesn't support the revolution. Instead, he went after communists and socialists and leftists, and also Hungary's Jewish population. And this last part is important because it would eventually lead up to Hungary's eventual siding with Nazi Germany. So what did Hungary do in World War II? Well, Hungary in the interwar period actually regained some of its land that was lost during the Treaty of Trianon, actually thanks to the Nazis and the Italian fascists. The Czechoslovaks were annexed by Germany during the 1938 Sudetenland crisis, and parts of that land that was taken during the Treaty of Trianon was given back to Hungary. Northern Transylvania was negotiated back to Hungary from Romania, I believe under pressure from the Germans and the Italians. And the Hungarians also took part in the invasion of Yugoslavia, which is what Serbia, Croatia, and Montenegro became following World War I. And they did that in order to take some of the land that they had lost during the treaty. So the reason Hungary joined World War II was that after Operation Barbarossa in 1941, an unknown party that still hasn't been identified, but it's speculated to have been the Germans themselves, they bombed the Hungarian city of Kassa, which led to Hungary declaring war against the Soviet Union. So hundreds of thousands of Hungarian soldiers go into the Soviet Union along with the German and Romanian armies, and they suffer very heavy losses against the Red Army. But while this is going on, Horthy was, despite being a nationalist and very authoritarian, was also pragmatic, and he tried to reach out to the Allies and not escalate any further. But the problem is that the Nazis caught on to this, and in 1943, the regency of Miklos Horthy was replaced by a Nazi puppet regime called the Arrow Cross Party. And they went on to extend the Holocaust into Hungary, with most Jews outside of Budapest and really in Hungary in general being deported or murdered, with around 600,000 out of 800,000, around 70% of them being either killed or deported. In 1945, 1 year later, the Red Army invaded Hungary, and they ended the extermination, as well as removing the Arrow Cross Party from power. The end of World War II also saw Central and Eastern Europe, including Hungary, being occupied by Stalin's Red Army, which fought a war of annihilation against the Third Reich, and arguably by now was the most formidable land force in the whole world, arguably even more so than the American army. And not surprisingly, the Soviets established communist governments in the European nations that they occupied, including a new communist regime in Hungary, headed by the ardent Stalinist known as Matyas Rákóczi. So with the end of World War II and the downfall of both the Axis and the pre-war great powers of France and Britain, the world was now a massive chessboard, with the main superpower on the oceans and the air being the United States, while the main rival on land was the Soviet Union. America's sphere was mostly in Western Europe, but they like even before the World Wars, their backyard was South America, and they now had a few other areas that they occupied, like Japan and South Korea. Eastern and Central Europe, however, was definitely part of the domain of the USSR, and the USA didn't even try to challenge that part of Soviet hegemony. Instead, they just tried to contain communism in areas that were a bit more on the margins and were more contested, like in South America, in Southeast Asia with the Vietnam War, and also in Africa or the Middle East. And this is important because after a decade of rule by Rákóczi, that's actually how his name is pronounced, even by the standards of which was considered bad even by the standards of the Communist Party, and it was also exposed by Nikita Khrushchev, Rákóczi was withdrawn, and the Hungarians rose up against his regime in 1956. I read a bit more into this, and I was actually surprised to find that the 1956 revolution was actually also carried out by some communists themselves. It was started by the reform-minded prime minister known as Imre Nagy, and he viewed Rákóczi's regime as going too far, and he wanted to put more policies that were in line with what the Hungarian people actually wanted. But what actually provoked the attacks by the Soviets was that he said that Hungary would leave the Soviet military alliance in Central Eastern Europe known as the Warsaw Pact. So the Hungarians people themselves rose up without many heavy weapons. They mostly used bottles and fire bombs, as well as some pistols, and they're going up against fully armed Hungarian police and soldiers, and also Soviet tanks that just rolled into the country, which is also where the term tanky comes from. Because many communists who are watching this worldwide, who are watching the revolution, viewed the Soviet response, which was very, very brutal, as being similar to how a colonial government would deal with protesters. And interestingly, this was cited by Martin Luther King Jr., who condemned the crackdown, and he used it as an example of how illegal actions could be done for a good cause. And he compared it to how many sit-down strikes by African Americans were illegal, but they were morally justified in the face of segregation. So after the revolution, there was another leader named János Kádár who was installed by the Soviets, and he actually made Hungary one of the less repressive and more open regimes in the Soviet sphere. And there was even some degree of private businesses and travel to the West, which was much less restricted than in other parts of the Warsaw Pact. And it's also it's also where one of the most famous toys of all time was created, that being the Rubik's Cube in the late 1970s, made by Erno Rubik, the famous inventor. However, by the 1980s, there was major stagnation and problems with the debt to the outside Western creditors, and this just also went along with the general Soviet decline. And in 1988, János Kádár stepped down from power, and in 1989, which is the same year as the fall of the Berlin Wall, Hungary opened up its border with Austria, and it broke the Iron Curtain. And by 1990, there were free elections, and the one-party state was gone. So where is Hungary today? The end of communism in Hungary was the beginning of the current Hungary, that being a right-wing populist and EU-aligned but sympathetic to Russia-type country that we know of in 2025. But it didn't start out that way. So in the 1990s, it was a time of pluralistic democracy, but it was also a time of economic instability and strife because there were many reforms. Capitalism shocked the country. There was lots of growing inequality, privatization, and unemployment. And many of the former communist bosses just became new parts of the capitalist elite class. Hungary was taken up by oligarchs, kind of in a similar way to Russia, but more through the legal channels, because in Russia it was just very bald-faced looting of the state by former Soviet politicians. The end of communism also saw Hungary joining the EU in 2004, along with other Warsaw Pact nations such as Poland, Czechia, and Slovakia, who are also part of the Visegrad Group, which is dedicated to becoming a kind of cultural political forum for the four Central European nations who are not quite Western and liberal, but also not quite Eastern and illiberal. In 2006, there was a leaked speech from a Socialist Party leader who admitted that his party had lied morning, noon, and night to win the elections, and that collapsed public confidence in them. No one wanted to vote for them after that got leaked. And it led to the center-right Fidesz party winning, and that was led by a man known today as Viktor Orban. Orban is now the most powerful man in Hungary. He's effectively Hungary's version of the Turkish leader Erdogan. He's democratic on paper, but he wouldn't be if he wasn't being contained by the structure of the state that prevents him from taking over. Orban championed himself as the defender of the West, and he implemented a number of very hostile and radical policies to keep out refugees and migrants, something that he's both been attacked for by human rights organizations, but also praised for by European nationalists and people who are just really critical of immigration to Europe. Because refugees and immigration into Europe is probably the most controversial issue there today, probably more than anything else, except for maybe Russia. Viktor is also part of a new wave of political strongmen who appeared in the 2010s, with the most visible and controversial of them also being Donald Trump, Benjamin Netanyahu, Vladimir Putin, and Xi Jinping. And not surprisingly, Orban gets along pretty well with all of them. And today, Hungary's future is very uncertain because the EU that it's a part of is going through major issues. There's both the migrant crisis, there's the demographic problems and economic issues, but there's also a very questionable alliance with the United States, largely thanks to Donald Trump and his kind of disdain for European allies who he believes just aren't really pulling their weight in the global defense system. And then there's, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and we don't know how far that's going to go. So what can we conclude about this very unique and fascinating country? Well, for one, history is often very strange because Hungary is a European nation today that was originally made up of ancient Siberian nomads who became Europeanized to the point Hungary is now one of the loudest and proudest defenders of Western civilization and Christendom. Revolutions often fail, but freedom can come anyways from forces outside of the control of the rebels because Hungary's uprisings always failed, but their occupiers and the overlords who ruled over them eventually fell out of power, though usually only replaced by more overlords and occupiers of some kind. It goes back to what I was saying about if the scene in Megamind where the Titan just says, I wouldn't say free, just under new management was a country, that country would probably be Hungary. They were invaded and conquered by Ottomans, and then they were freed and then occupied again by Austrians, and then they broke away after the Austrians dissolved, only to be reinvaded again by the Nazis and then the Soviets. And it's only now that, with the end of the USSR, that Hungary's independent. But we don't know if it's going to stay that way with the way that Putin's been acting in the region. And it also shows that societies can swing rapidly from one side to the other, because Hungary went from being a country ruled by a Nazi puppet party to becoming a communist nation, and now it's back on the right with a hardline right-wing populist party in control. So at the end of the day, I think we could say a strange starting point will probably lead to a strange end point, and that is Hungary from start to finish. Thank you for listening into the World History Addicts podcast. We have an Instagram page at the World History Addicts podcast, which you can follow and subscribe to for more content and releases. There will be more episodes that follow specific countries and regions and others that focus more on world history. Thank you again, and hopefully you can join us in the next episode.